Now, in what could be the biggest case yet in the country's battle against state capture, prosecutors are investigating advisory fees paid to a known Gupta associate, Salim Essa, by two Chinese rail groups involved in Transnet contracts. The allegations were first revealed in the 2017 Guptaleaks documents, a massive cache of emails leaked to the Daily Maverick. The NPA is now probing whether the 40 billion in contracts may have been tainted by fraud or corruption. Joining us now to share his perspective on the case is Director of Investigations at Anti-Corruption Group Shadow World Investigations, Paul Holden. Paul, good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
This obviously is a story that has piqued a lot of interest and it has been building up for some time. You have done quite a lot of investigations on this. Just maybe briefly tell us what your investigations have uncovered as far as this matter is concerned.
Sure. So I engaged with the Zondo Commission of Inquiry over quite a long period of time, about 2 years. Initially, I investigated the capture of Transnet using the Guptaleaks and other sort of leaked material, including banking records that have been leaked from HSBC. In relation to Salim Essa's companies. And then subsequent to making that evidence available to the Commission, they then asked me to come in and help calculate the cost of state capture and try to track where some of the money went that was stolen through state capture. So I ended up giving I think it was about 8 days of evidence in total before the Zondo Commission. And primarily my role was to try and investigate just where the money was spent and how much the Gupta enterprise secured from state capture. So how many billions of rands they were actually paid in total from state capture. And quite a lot of my work focused on Transnet because Transnet, in my calculations, actually turned out to be the primary site of state capture. It was the place where the Guptas earned the most money and where the most amount of money was spent on dodgy contracts.
Now, as things stand at the moment, I mean, the NPA is yet to share a lot of information about the case. Understandably, it's still under investigations. No charges have been laid. But what were some of the key findings as far as Transnet? The investigations itself into state capture, uncovering quite a number of issues. For you, primarily, what were the key issues at hand?
I mean, I think, in relation to this case in particular, I think two things really stand out. The first is just the extent of obvious wrongdoing. I think the Zondo Commission really goes into depth in the Transnet case and shows the extent to which the whole procurement process was utterly distorted and, crazy decisions were made in order to ensure that these Chinese rail companies won these enormous contracts. I mean, they were absolutely huge. And that's the other thing that's really striking about them is the size and the scale of these contracts. They're worth tens of billions of rands, and the amount of kickbacks that were paid were really huge. So, based on the information that we were able to gather and analyze, it looked like the Gupta enterprise, as the Commission calls it, was earning 20% of all of those contracts, was being kicked back to them. And according to my calculations, we know at least 3.5 billion rand had been paid to them. And we expected a further 3.5 billion rand was paid to the Gupta enterprise, which is really just an absolutely enormous sum of money.
I mean, if you look at some of the cases here, you can break it up into a number of sections where we're talking about a case that has received a lot of attention, the McKinsey, how they got the contract to advise Transnet and how many new engines, were needed to buy, the issue of 1,000 new locomotives to upgrade the aging fleet, which was way back in 2012. If you look into some of those aspects, I mean, what were the key findings in terms of the linking, particularly the Guptas to the contracts?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there was very, very clear evidence that the Guptas were involved. I mean, in terms of McKinsey, the Commission found, and I think it's pretty well established in the public record, that McKinsey was working very closely with regiments and Salim Essa, and they got contracts in relation to Transnet because of those contacts and because those contacts to Salim Essa and the Gupta enterprise. In terms of the 1064 contract, the Guptas are very clearly involved because they are the primary recipients of the kickbacks. What we see is that the Guptaleaks revealed these internal accounting ledgers this famous document called the 2015 working document, which had been put together by CSR employees and basically showed how many kickbacks have been paid, who was receiving them, and how many kickbacks remain to be paid. And then we have, some really, key evidence is what they call these business development agreements between companies controlled by Salim Essa and the Chinese rail companies. So in that regard, it's really striking. He sets up these two Hong Kong companies, and his name is actually on the company formation documents. He is listed as the director, and those two companies get paid over $200 million by these Chinese rail manufacturers. And this is a company that doesn't do any business. It's based in Hong Kong. It has no employees. They literally just set up to receive this money. And as soon as the money comes in, it's immediately paid out and it's dissipated, including, we found like a small amount of that money went to go pay some of the Gupta wedding costs. So, the things that they tend to spend their money on most often were these incredibly elaborate weddings. The findings are, in relation to the 1064 contract, one, that, the contracts themselves are tainted by incredible irregularities in the procurement process. The decisions were made with the highest level officials, people like Brian Molefe, that made no sense whatsoever in order to favor CSR and CNR. And then just, very real and very well clearly evidenced documents that show the extent to which the Gupta enterprise and Salim Essa's companies were actually paid these kickbacks. We have the bank statements, we have the transaction records that show these payments were made.
So the case of Brian Molefe and Anuj Singh already has been in court on charges of corruption and fraud. But then there's also the other aspects that I spoke about which have not been enrolled in court. The probing of whether the locomotives themselves were overcharging. But most importantly, this week we saw documents that were presented to Parliament talk about investigations that they were probing contracts worth over 40.1 billion linked to payments for this particular locomotives. Now, as far as that information is concerned, is it just about the fraud, or does it still go back to the issue of the locomotives and the inflated figures that came with the locomotives?
I think it's I would imagine that the MPA is considering a whole range of different charges. The one would be, charges against people like Brian Molefe for violating what's called the Public Finance Management Act, which, requires public officials to, safeguard public funds and not spend money willy-nilly and follow procurement processes. I'd imagine, the findings of the commission, the Zonda Commission, were pretty clear about Brian Molefe and people like Anuj Singh, that there was a pretty powerful case of corruption to be made against them. And the thing that I always thought was really fascinating, and it's actually, if people want to read more about it, it's in the specific commission report on Transnet, was the extent of discoveries made by the commission of the cash that was handed to public officials and the cash that they were storing in this place called Knox Vaults in Kalani, at the very same time as they are basically ensuring these contracts go to Gupta-related companies. And then there's money laundering charges, which would be prosecuted under what's called the Prevention of Organized Crime Act, or POCA. It's very clear that what the Guptas were doing, and a very large part of my work, was establishing the extent to which the bribes were paid to the Guptas and were laundered around the world, really, to hide their origins and to make sure that these illicit proceeds could be used. There's a whole range of different charges that can be brought against people like Brian Molefe, against the Chinese companies themselves, or their South African entities, and against people like Salim Essa.
Primarily, the NPA is probing whether the China South Rail paid Tekestra, a company naturally linked to the Gupta Lieutenant Salim Essa. But also, China North Rail seems to be involved to a certain extent here, Paul. Paul?
Hello? I just lost you there for a second.
Okay. I was saying that prosecutors are also probing China North Rail for involvement also in the case, not only China South Rail. How is China North Rail involved in this particular case?
Sure. So, China North Rail involved in two different aspects. To go right back to the beginning, the 1064 contract involved, a range of different types of locomotives that were going to be bought. Some were electric and some were diesel. They were all supposed to be used to expand Transnet's capacity to cover freight rail. At the time of the contracts, you had China North Rail China South Rail and China North Rail were involved in producing, as far as I remember offhand, the diesel locomotives, and China South Rail were dealing with the electric. It might be I've got those mixed up. But what really matters is that very shortly after those contracts awarded, both of those companies were actually amalgamated into a single company called CRRC. So they actually now form one company. And when the kickbacks were paid to Quest and other companies, they were actually paid by this conglomerate. So CNR were involved in that contract. But very interestingly, CNR were also involved in what's called what I call the BEX relocation contract. And what that was that there was a stipulation in some of the contracts that the production facilities for the locomotives had to be moved from their location in Gauteng to, as far as I remember, it was KZN.
KwaZulu-Natal, yes.
And that whole contract made no sense whatsoever. But what was then discovered was that this weird cut-out entity in South Africa called BEX, which was advising China North Rail, and they signed these contracts which basically said, China North Rail wants BEX to get these contracts to be increased in value exponentially. So, when they were first quoted, the relocation costs would have been around 10 million rand. Eventually, when the contracts are concluded, it's over 100 million rand, as far as I remember, that is paid in those relocation contracts. And what happened there was that BEX was then paid money by China North Rail as their commission fee in relation to that particular transaction. And when I was working at the commission, one thing that we did was try to sort of establish, where did that BEX money go? And amongst other places, we traced it to a company called Integrated Capital Management, which was controlled by Stanley Shane, who at the time was a director of Transnet. So CNR is involved in both, the 1064 contract with the actual locomotives and also this relocation contract, where we see kickbacks being paid, I think quite unusually in South Africa itself, to companies controlled by people like Stanley Shane.
Paul, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming through to talk to us this evening. I appreciate your time.